So in today's overview, we're going to be talking about what is vulnerability, the 6 myths of vulnerability, and a flight activity that we can all put into practice together. So, starting question, fundamental question. What is vulnerability? Anybody? What do you think it means? Anymore?
You have to class more on Roman makers. I believe vulnerability is just the ability to be open, to know your weaknesses, and to put them out there.
Okay, great, thank you. Now we'll do one more.
Hey, everybody, it's Berman. I go Eagles. I would say vulnerability is the method and the ability to say when you're wrong and also be open about when you need help.
Great, there's no wrong or right answers, right? So vulnerability is the emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Through this path will allow us to go create courage, daring leadership skills, trust, and innovation. Roosevelt once said, daring is not saying, I'm willing to risk failure. Daring is saying, I know I will eventually fail, but I'm still all in. I've never met a brave person who hasn't known disappointment, failure, or even heartbreak. Vulnerability is not about winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome. Through vulnerability comes the idea of having a close network, friends, family, relationship. Get clear on whose opinions of you matter. There are going to be a million cheap seats in today's world, filled with people who will never be brave but will spend every single ounce of energy they have hauling advice and judgment to those who dare greatly. I think C.S. Lewis makes a great point, and he sums it up pretty well. He states, to love is to be vulnerable. And I want you to keep that in the back of your head as we conclude this presentation later on. Now, let's talk about some myths. Myth number 1, vulnerability is a weakness. Why do you think people think that? It's a weakness. Sir.
I think that it is perceived as weakness because in some scenarios the vulnerability can be used against you, kind of like a blackmail or like an insult back towards you.
Okay, great, thank you. So let me ask a follow-up question. Can any of you guys give me a single example of courage you've experienced in another cadet or in your life that did not require experiencing vulnerability?
When I failed my TFA, not everyone failed the TFA, but having the courage to connect with me on the sense of failure, which most of us gone through, they helped me to keep going and keep pushing, and eventually I passed the TFA.
Good, great. This crumbles under the weight of data and people's lived experiences of courage. Through all the data and collection, they've proven to be that this is a myth. Vulnerability is actually not a weakness. Now, myth number 2, I don't do vulnerability. I don't even know what that is. That's never gonna be my vocab term, right? My bank. But you can either do vulnerability or it can do you. Choosing to own our vulnerability and do it consistently means learning how to rumble with this emotion and understand how it drives our thinking and behavior. Now, pretending that we don't do vulnerability means letting our fear drive our thinking and behavior without input or even awareness, which almost leads to acting out or even shutting down. A quote by Madeline England states, when we were children, we used to think that when we were grown up, we would no longer be vulnerable. But to grow up is to accept vulnerability. Myth number 3, I can do it alone. It's me against the world. I don't need anybody's help. Well, one of the most used line of defense that you kind of come across is, I don't need to be vulnerable because I don't need anybody. Needing no one pushes against everything we know about human neurobiology. We are hardwired for connection. I don't even need to be studying in this major or this field to understand that connection in today's society is extremely important. And we need to have those connections and the people that we can rely on closely, right? We weren't born to walk alone. For example, has anybody by show of hands have felt alone? If you felt alone. Now, how does being alone feel like? Just give me, you go ahead, Maura, you can shout it out. Just shout it out.
Feels empty.
Empty. Good job.
It feels like there's nobody in your corner.
Nobody in the corner. Remember us.
It feels isolated.
Isolate. Reyes and then.
It feels like you can't talk to anybody or get advice from anyone.
And then Gillespie.
It's terrifying. It feels like you're in a void with no way of getting out.
Exactly. Myth number 4. You can engineer the uncertainty and discomfort out of vulnerability. So what does that mean? Many people walk into work every day with a straightforward task, engineering vulnerability and uncertainty out of systems and mitigating risk. This comes down to relational vulnerability and systemic vulnerability. Systemic vulnerability acts as a whole class of technology, but does not include vulnerability that is selectively introduced to introduce one or more target, that technologies that are connected with a particular person. So systemic basically boils down to a hard structure, like it's pretty much perfect, there's no human error, right? But the problem with that is once we try to unstrip that uncertainty, the risk, and the emotional exposure from the relational experience, we pretty much bankrupt courage by definition. You can go and consider that out the door. Myth number 5, trust comes before vulnerability. Now, we need to trust to be vulnerable, and we need to be vulnerable in order to build trust. This can't work without one or the other. They both have to go hand in hand. And it's very crucial that you guys can understand this process of having trust and vulnerability. But you may be asking, how do I know if I can trust someone enough to be vulnerable? Or can I build trust without ever risking that vulnerability? The answer is you can. We can use a nice analogy known as the marble jar. The marble jar is a metaphor for trust. People can earn trust one small gesture at a time. Each gesture allows you to put a marble in your jar. For example, for me, filmmaking is such a strong hobby of mine. So being able to reach out to people to ask them to help out with my film and them actually taking the time to come out and actually be there, that's a small gesture, and they've earned trust in my marble jar because, man, this means a lot to me, and this person's coming out and they're showing the support for that. So, but on the other hand, trust disrupting behaviors result into a handful of marbles coming out of the jar. And we know how difficult trust is to rebuild that disrupted. Trust is built slowly, one meaningful gesture at a time. And then myth number 6, vulnerability is disclosure. Vulnerability is not a personal marketing tool. And we don't measure vulnerability by how much someone discloses or shares. We don't overshare, because what ends up happening is we have fake vulnerability. So it can look like a leader telling us that we can ask questions, but not taking the time to create a psychological safety to do it, or not offering a pause in the conversation for anyone else to speak up at all. This leads to ineffectiveness, and this breeds the trust. It can result into pulling out more marbles from your jar. Oftentimes, this is associated with oversharing and sympathy seeking. For example, feel sorry for me and don't hold me accountable for leading through this hard time because I'm too scared to. Something that we can do to help out with this is ask this crucial question. What does support for me look like? Asking this question up front can help prevent resentment and also get people to think about what type of support will be helpful. All of us in this room have a unique leadership style. As you come across through your ROTC journey, you'll learn how to utilize that and build your own style of leadership, right? It helps hold people accountable for asking what they need It can also be important to clarify the behaviors that aren't considered helpful to a specific situation. This also leads to boundaries, which is a whole topic in itself. But in short, setting boundaries is making clear what's okay and what's not okay and why. And to finally, like I said, to feel is to be vulnerable, or you can replace feel with love. To feel or to love is to be vulnerable. Believing that vulnerability is weakness is believing that feeling is weakness. And like it or not, we are emotional beings. So now, what we're gonna do now is we're gonna skip some of this. So what's gonna happen on your worksheet? You're gonna see 8 questions. You and your flight, all GMC and all POC, you guys are gonna pick questions that you guys want to discuss together as a group. We're gonna skip the part where you guys write down, but instead we're gonna have a group discussion. And we're gonna do this for the next 10 minutes. So is everybody tracking what we need to do next? Okay, so let's go ahead and break out into our groups and we'll have a good discussion about what we just learned.